I'm joined here today by four exceptional speakers to discuss a hotly debated topic, a topic that's very relevant to what has been going on, especially here in Greece these past few years. So, can the periphery countries return to growth, and how can this growth be achieved? This is the question on everyone's mind from day one, and the speakers of this panel will try to provide some answers. So we're starting with Mr. Stuart, Holland, professor at the University of Coimbra, Portugal, and a senior scholar at the Institute for Social and European Studies in Hungary.
Thank you. Well, we're getting off to a rather slow start here. So I'm going to take the relaxed approach and analyze some of what I think has gone wrong in the past before coming to what I think can be done now. I've just brought out a book and therefore ruthlessly publicize it. You can't see a thing from where you're sitting, but there's some details and some decent endorsements of it. And copies of these are outside. And its title is, Europe is the title of this session, or my contribution, which is Europe in Question and What to Do About It. It's commonplace to claim that the problem we are in is due to design faults for the euro. But I submit in the book, and have submitted in practice for the last 40 years, that the design fault is much deeper, and that's in the supranationalism of Jean Monnet. Jean Monnet never ran for elected office. He was a technocrat. He was the first commissaire au plan, head of the French plan, appointed by de Gaulle, and he reacted with de Gaulle's support then, at the end of the war, in giving the Planning Commission powers to issue directives to ministries. Why is this relevant? Because it's overlooked that the European Commission is based on the Commissariat au Plan, with one big difference. It doesn't plan. The power of directives meant that when de Gaulle resigned at the end of World War II, he was, in the interim, the provisional president of France. Monnet went ahead with his European designs, and first, as I think everybody knows, with the European Coal and Steel Community in 1950. But then things didn't go very far or wide. For example, in 1950, he met Clement Attlee, the Labour Prime Minister, and explained that the high authority of the coal and steel community would have the power to issue directives to governments. To which Attlee said, no, thank you. Or in other words, made a statement to Parliament saying, this may suit some continental European countries, but it doesn't suit us. Why did it not suit? Because it would override not only the autonomy of governments, but the power of elected assemblies and parliaments. And why was that significant in the longer run? Because in reaction to the creation of the European Economic Community in 1957, Britain formed an alternative grouping, EFTA, European Free Trade Area, with 7 other countries, who otherwise might well have joined the initial European Economic Community. And the problem also was that the whole EEC framework was rushed for several reasons. One, they achieved the European Coal and Steel Community in 1952, But then the Dutch proposed a European political community, which never got off the ground. Then there was a proposal for a European defense community, which was defeated, rejected in the French Parliament because the procedures, qualified majority voting, weighting majority voting, had not yet been adopted, so the French Parliament could block it. And then and what in fact was happening? Jean Monnet's grand design was going nowhere. So what did they do? They said, well, let's not be so ambitious. Let's just have a common market. Then some things went seriously wrong. For example, France, as one of the key co-founders of the post-war European project, everyone knows of the Schuman Declaration of the coal and steel community, even though it was incorrect, that in this way another war between France and Germany will be not only morally unthinkable but materially impossible. France was completely preoccupied by other things at the time that the Rome Treaty was signed on the 25th of March 1957. What were they? Many of you, many of us, more senior citizens now, will know very well. What I find is that students and graduate students of European integration have no idea. There was the Suez fiasco in 1956, which, of course, failed. This followed defeat in Vietnam. Then there was a coup d'etat by the French army in Algeria, which then occupied Corsica, and the threat that paratroopers would land not on the Place de la Concorde, but at Rambouillet, seize power, and wish to install de Gaulle with new and sweeping presidential powers. There was real fear in France of Bonapartism. Bonapartism in the sense not only of the first, well, not at all perhaps the first, but maybe the third Napoleon, but also that there were dictatorships in Spain and Portugal. There had recently been dictatorships in Germany and in Italy. And the result was that Guy Mollet, who at the time, from 1956-57, was Prime Minister of France, paid no attention whatever to the decision-making procedures in the Rome Treaty, which I happen to know because when I was later advising our then Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, on Europe in 1967, there was a meeting at Chequers, which is the Prime Minister's official country residence, and a discussion of Europe, and Mollet said, this has been a disaster, first 10 years of it, this has been a disaster. France is governed by press conferences by de Gaulle, and its international and economic policies are governed by Brussels. So I said to him afterwards, Prime Minister, and I wasn't Prime Minister, Monsieur Mollet, but at the time you were Prime Minister of France, surely you knew what was in the Rome Treaty, in other words, binding qualified majority voting. And he said, yes, but we had so many treaties at the time. We had the Coal and Steel Community Treaty, the Dutch proposal for a political community, the defense community proposal, Euratom, and we all thought Euratom was going to be far more important than this common market. We never imagined that a commission in Brussels would insist on a rigid interpretation of a treaty, article by article, forever, which is what has happened. Where do we get now in the current situation? The proposal for the euro certainly was flawed. And there are many, many criticisms of that from different perspectives. It also, well, until the Eurozone crisis, it was all right. You know, interest rates on government bonds were almost synchronized at low levels. There was no great divergence. But when the Eurozone crisis hit, and of course, Greece was in the front line, and it became clear that Angela Merkel and Wolfgang Schäuble will not support Greece, the whole thing went wrong. In other words, three German chancellors in particular, Adenauer, Brandt, and Helmut Kohl, wanted to lock Germany into Europe. What, of course, has happened with the euro, is that Europe has been locked into Germany. And a Germany with a profoundly deflationary bias based on a misreading of history. Because whenever inflation comes up, people assume, as if inflation were a problem now, it's disinflation is the problem now. But the obsession of the Bundesbank historically has been that public spending risks inflation, and it was inflation which was responsible for the rise of Hitler, which it wasn't. In 1929, support for the Nazi Party was less than 3%. Let me repeat that, less than 3%. Then Heinrich Brüning introduced deflationary policies, limits to wage increases, cuts in public spending, cuts in credit to enterprise, which resulted in a massive rise of unemployment, so that by 1933, support for the Nazi Party was 34%. And if one looks at the similarity, as Gustav Horn has done, of the German Deutsche Wirtschaftsinstitute, you can get an almost perfect fit between the deflationary effects on Greece and the deflationary effects of Weimar under Brüning, which enabled the rise of that catastrophic extremism. There's also something else which I think is deeply significant, and it relates to the difference between center and peripheral European countries. Because the German and the Dutch for debt, Schuld, is the same word as for guilt, being guilty. And you needn't just take it from me, you can take it from Nietzsche. In his Genealogy of Morals, he said, it is characteristic of strong German creditors, he stressed that, German creditors, that they not only want repayment from weak debtors, they want to punish them. Now, you can put your own interpretation of that, but I, in the book, have argued from a back. I started as a historian. I used to teach modern history and political theory. There's another unfortunate conjunction of two words, Protestant and ethic, by Max Weber. Max Weber said that it was the Protestant ethic gave rise to capitalism, and he was wrong. I don't know what many Bavarian Catholics would think about that, but who on God's earth has actually read the whole of Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which runs to about, in one edition, to about 660 pages. But many, many, many Germans know the association of Protestant and ethic. It's hard work. Wolfgang Schäuble, writing in The Guardian, saying, Die deutsche Frage ist zurück. The German question is back. But we don't want to impose a German Europe. We just want other countries to be competitive. But the very founding documents of the European community, the Messina Conference, the Spark Report of 1956, stressed that there would inevitably be different efficiency dynamics between Central European states and peripheral European states, and that there had to be strong countervailing policies, what Jan Tinbergen called positive integration instead of negative integration. Now, when I was an advisor at the advanced age of 25 to Harold Wilson on Europe, he was having trouble getting through to Charles de Gaulle. And the Foreign Office apparently had offended de Gaulle in some way. The ambassador in Paris was not acceptable at the Élysée. So I said, well, do you want me to get through to de Gaulle? And he said, Stuart, you're a clever lad, but are you seriously telling me you can do this? I recount this in the 3rd chapter of the book. I said, yes. How would you do it? I said, well, I know Pierre Joxe, who's the son of Louis Joxe, who's the Interior Minister of France. De Gaulle's right. He said, I know. How's your French? So I said something in French that satisfied him. Why is this more than just anecdotal? Because I made the case that Britain should support, and therefore other EFTA countries would support, de Gaulle's Luxembourg veto. That was at the end of January 1966. De Gaulle had pulled his ministers out of European councils in July on the basis that qualified majority voting, binding nation states, would be introduced in 1966. The Foreign Office didn't agree with this. I got it through. I also knew from a meeting at the French Ministry of Finance in January 66 that France could not afford the advanced technology programs to which de Gaulle was committed. Plan calcul, force de frappe, centrale nucléaire, armes nucléaires, TGV, Concorde 2. And so I proposed a European technology community, which would have meant a joint industrial policy, and the location of much of that industry could have been in peripheral Europe, as had been the basis of British regional policy. Wilson failed to follow through, and I resigned from number 10. That's purely anecdotal. But the options and the chances to have a confederal Europe, not a diktat from troikas, was missed, as also was the chance of joint European planning. Robert Marjolin, who had been the Secretary General of OEC, and therefore of Marshall Aid, had become the first French Vice President of the European Commission, and he proposed a medium-term economic policy committee, one which could actually look at and identify emerging internal contradictions in Europe, such as the fact that when they met at a very senior level, the heads of the French plan, the Italian plan, the Belgian plan, and a German called Langer, who was Assistant Under-Secretary of State for the Economy, the 6 member states found they were all planning to export more to each other than they were going to import from each other. These are very simple things which have gone wrong and given rise to asymmetries that should have been foreseen and should have been offset. I then met Jacques Delors in the 70s. We hit it off. When he became president of the Commission, he invited me to do something that had been initiated by Andreas Papandreou, which was before the first Greek European Council in December 83. Andreas invited me and a network of people, including Delors, to set out an alternative agenda for Europe which would have embodied the positive integration of Tinbergen. In other words, Europe adding value, doing together what we cannot so well do by ourselves. Andreas managed to persuade Mitterrand, and the result was the Single European Act of 1986, the first revision of the Rome Treaty, which committed Europe to something totally displaced and ignored in recent debates, to economic and social cohesion. Very French words, cohésion économique et sociale, but that's a full employment agenda. And then when Delors became president of the Commission, he appealed to me afterwards, in fact, in 97, 87, he became president in 85, he appealed to me to draft policies for economic and social cohesion. And one of the main ones which I did was to recognize you would never get cohesion by fiscal transfers between member states. The real lesson should be the American New Deal. Now, when Roosevelt managed from 1933 to 1939 to reduce unemployment in the States from 28 million to 8 million, he didn't do it by classic Keynesian fiscal stimulus. He did it by bonds, by shifting savings high in a recession or depression into fixed interest bond borrowing and investments. It's widely overlooked. The average federal deficit in the States in the 1930s was 3%. It was the Maastricht deficit stability limit. And I've been arguing the case for bonds ever since. And more recently, in fact, I recommended to Delors that he set up a European investment fund which could actually not only issue bonds, but could recycle global surpluses. Because the European Investment Bank, there's not time to go into it in detail, but the European Investment Bank has been very heavily dependent on pension funds and on co-finance by national partners, which was hit with the Eurozone crisis. Now, the fund is now the sister institution of the EIB in the EIB group. It exists. It's done virtually nothing since Delors set it up in '94, but it can do this. And in evidence, the Economic and Social Committee, social partners in Brussels in 2012, the EIB and EIF said this could be done. In other words, the bonds which are so anathema to Merkel and Schäuble don't need national guarantees, fiscal transfers, treaty revisions. The EIB, I was about to say something about former Commission President Barroso, but I'll leave that for the time being. I'll make the point. He proposed project bonds. Not realizing the European Investment Bank has been financing projects by bonds since 1958. The incompetence at the top of the Commission is simply staggering. But let's just come now, and then I'll finish in 3-4 minutes, to the Juncker recovery program. Now, the case that I've been making, could we have that figure, please? Now, it'll be very hard for you to see any of that from there. And I was told I wouldn't need this, but perhaps I do. Okay, 60% Maastricht debt limit. It's called reconciling stability with growth. The issue of EIB and EIF bonds from a low base would have multiplier effects which can be very, very high. EIB investment multipliers have been 2.5 to 3%. And then attached to that, there are fiscal and income multipliers. Now, Juncker has talked of a 300 billion recovery program, which is a serious figure. But it appears from Emmanuel Macron, economy minister in France, from the FT last week, that he's very concerned there won't be any new real money. And I've been trying to get through to Martin Selmayr, who's the chef de cabinet to Juncker, aided by the fact that when the Economic and Social Committee brought out a proposal called Restarting Growth in 2012, Jean-Claude came to the launch. I was asked to present the case. I'd already passed him the case, including the rationale behind his figure. And I've also been trying to get through to other commissioners on this, that there is far too much concern with where is the money coming from and does Germany have to pay? And the answer is no. The money can come from recycling global surpluses. On September the 25th, the BRICS in Washington said, if Europe would issue Eurobonds for recovery, we would invest in them. And there are vast global surpluses of uninvested savings. Bill Gross of PIMCO has got about $1 trillion in his fund, and he can't find adequate investment outlets. The China Investment Corporation, one of the biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world, made a loss on its private sector investments in Europe in 2012 and said it wanted longer-term, preferably 10-year plus, public investments and that it would fund the bonds. So I'm rather skeptical. I think that Jean-Claude Juncker intends very well. I'm rather skeptical about what we're going to see on Tuesday, which is apparently an announcement of the policies. There'll be a lot of shuffling of the pack and a big risk, because there's one great asset which never appears in the press. European Investment Bank bonds do not count on national debt. Why is that a great asset? Because the criteria which were agreed in the 1997 Amsterdam Special Action Programme are wide-ranging, that it should invest in health, education, urban renewal, the environment, green technologies. Whereas the press is all now full of, what will the criteria be for this investment-led recovery? And there's even a proposal, God help us, that projects will be put out to competitive tender for the criteria, not even for the projects. I mean, the memory loss, the ignorance, the displacement of past European Council decision-making in the recent debate, not by Jean-Claude, because, you know, I know that he actually read the damn briefing, which was only about a page and a half that I gave him in Brussels, and we talked about it, and I followed it through. These criteria are vast, yes. For example, when I proposed them, and Antonio Guterres, Prime Minister of Portugal, got them through the European Council in 1997, his international secretary said to me, Stuart, urban renewal. We live in urban societies. That could mean anything. And then added, which is presumably what you want. And of course I said yes. What we actually have got here in the EIB and for its sister, the EIF, is a European public sector borrowing requirement without using its name. The potential is vast. So some people are going to say, well, let's complete the 10s. I'm finishing on this. Let's complete the 10s. Let's go for broadband. Let's go for this. These things don't need to be reinvented. They're there already, and what's needed on them, I think, is action now. Thank you very much.
Next up, we've got Megan Greene, Chief Economist at Manulife Asset Management.
Many thanks. I apologize in advance if I sniffle my way through this presentation. I've got a really bad cold. The question that I've been asked to answer along with my fellow panelists is, can the periphery return to growth? My argument on that would be yes, so that's the good news. The second question I would pose is, will it? And there I'm a bit more skeptical and pessimistic. I think it will, but it will take about a decade, and that will be a decade that's a Japanese-style lost decade with extremely low growth, extremely low inflation. Thanks. The one big difference is that in Japan, they're facing about 4% unemployment, whereas in the Eurozone, I think employment will remain stubbornly high. We've seen it come off of its peaks in pretty much all of the Eurozone countries, but it will be much higher than 4%. Now, the approach to the Eurozone crisis from the very start has mostly been that all of the weaker countries in the Eurozone need to adjust so that they all look a bit more like Germany. And what does that mean? Well, Germany's growth model is based on a really high level of national savings. And they've been exporting their investments to other countries, primarily in the Eurozone, for the past 15 years, roughly. And they've been exporting those investments to places like the Greek sovereign bond market, the Irish property market, the Portuguese retail market. So those investments never really panned out well for the Germans. But nevertheless, German national savings remain pretty high. They've been exporting their way to growth. And the idea in the weaker countries in the Eurozone was that they needed to undergo an internal devaluation, since they're all tethered to the euro, so they can't devalue their currency. They do this by cutting wages and prices, seeing prices fall, which is exactly what we're seeing now, so that they can boost competitiveness. They'll increase their own national savings and will export their way to growth. So everybody's trying to look more like Germany. The adjustment is happening specifically in the weaker countries, not in the stronger countries. Now, this hasn't worked out very well for the periphery. Italy's in recession. Greece is finally back growing after an astronomical depression. The other weaker countries in the periphery are, growing a little bit. Spain is doing better than the other peripheral countries. France is stagnant. So it hasn't really been a great process for the weaker countries, not to say sort of the social and political costs. It hasn't really been working out for Germany lately either. So Germany's seen its exports fall. It's seen industrial production fall. It's seen its new orders fall. I spent the weekend with the CDU party from Germany a few weekends ago, and when I mentioned this to them, they don't want to admit that there's a problem. So one thing I think we need to see to have Europe avoid a Japanese-style lost decade is we need to see a totally different approach to this crisis, whereby the adjustment is much more symmetric. Germany adjusts as well as the weaker countries. That requires Germany admitting that it needs to do something different. What does Germany need to do differently? Germany suffers from chronic underinvestment domestically. And it's partly because German companies don't think that they can make as high returns in Germany as they could in the Greek sovereign bond market, for example. It's also partly because energy costs in Germany are so high. So, for example, now a lot of German companies are building plants in the US off the back of the shale gas revolution, where energy costs are going to be really low, in their opinion. So as a result of this, we've got decrepit roads, decrepit bridges across Germany. Germany's facing record low borrowing costs. What better time to borrow in the markets to rebuild your decrepit infrastructure? Germany's not against investing domestically. The question is just, how do you finance this? And on that, Germany is sticking to its fiscal orthodoxy. The Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble is determined to achieve a balanced budget next year. So, he has announced some measures to increase investment domestically and maybe increase government borrowing to do so over the next couple of years. It won't kick in until 2016, so we've got a while to wait. It's not nearly enough and not nearly fast enough. So unfortunately, I don't think we're really going to see this happen. Germany doesn't really think it needs growth, actually. So Germany's not at all concerned about the fact that it has all these bad economic indicators coming out. Because who needs growth when you have jobs and a balanced budget, in their view? German unemployment is around 5%. It's pretty low compared to the rest of the Eurozone. So they don't really think they have a problem. And to the degree to which they'll actually admit they have a problem, they blame it on everybody else. So it's the Russians' fault for the sanctions that the West has had to impose on the Russians. And that certainly has impacted German growth. But German exports to Russia, it's about 3.3% of their exports. So that's not very much. Of course, there are indirect effects as well on the German economy, but that can't be the only explanation. The German government also thinks that it's France and Italy's fault because they're not undergoing the difficult structural reforms to find sustainable growth themselves, and so they're not providing enough demand for German goods and services. And that's also true to some degree. But in any case, if Germany thinks it's everybody else's fault, they don't think that they can really do anything about it. And there's also a political reason why I don't think we'll see a shift in this approach to the crisis, and that's the Alternative für Deutschland. It's an anti-Euro party in Germany, and it's gained a lot of support lately. It did really poorly in the German elections, did a bit better in the European Parliament elections last May, and in some regional elections it's done a lot better, and that's putting a lot of pressure on Chancellor Merkel and Finance Minister Schäuble to really toe a strict line with the weaker countries so that they don't lose voters to the Alternative for Deutschland. So this is the first of three things I think we need to see: a different approach to the crisis. I don't think we're going to see it happen, unfortunately. The second thing that we need to see, I do think we'll actually see happen, and we talked about it a bit in the last panel, that's we need the ECB to step in and buy some more time for policymakers. Now, the ECB has stepped in already a number of times, but it has recently stepped in to say it will buy up covered bonds and asset-backed securities and try to reflate some of the asset prices, try to improve confidence, get companies borrowing again. The ECB is trying to expand its balance sheet by about €1 trillion over the next 2 years. It won't succeed in doing this if all it's buying is covered bonds and asset-backed securities. So I think what we'll end up seeing is the ECB stepping in to buy up all private assets that aren't really nailed down to the floor. I think we'll see the ECB buying up corporate loans, for example. There are about $1.5 trillion of those in the Eurozone, so it could certainly achieve its target if it buys up a lot of those. The one thing I don't think we'll see, despite what previous panel members have insinuated, is the ECB stepping in and buying up sovereign debt. If Mario Draghi didn't step in to buy Spanish bonds when 2-year yields for Spain were above 7%, I can't see him stepping in to buy them when yields have compressed massively. Sovereign yields across the Eurozone are very low relative to fundamentals, so I don't think we'll see the ECB step in to do this. But let's pretend that the ECB does go ahead and buy up a load of sovereign debt. Is this really going to help? Well, it will help in two ways. One way, it will cause the euro to depreciate pretty significantly. We've already seen that happen ever since the announcement of any of these bond purchases by the ECB. We saw it happen again today off the back of Mario Draghi's speech this morning. And that will help the Eurozone in terms of its exports outside of the Eurozone. The Eurozone will be joining Japan and China in a beggar-thy-neighbor strategy towards growth. It's a currency war, and the big loser will be the US, unfortunately. But in any case, it will be good for the Eurozone. The other thing we'll see is it will buy time and room for policymakers to have to implement these really difficult, really politically unpopular structural reforms. The thing is, we saw Mario Draghi step in and buy policymakers 2 years of time when he made the whatever it takes speech. And what have policymakers done with that time? Bond yields came way down immediately, so the pressure from the markets was off. Matteo Renzi in Italy has won a major concession from his party on labor market reform, so that's something positive. But beyond that, he faces huge amounts of opposition from the trade unions. We've seen his reform agenda slow down a lot since then. In France, Holland hasn't done a whole lot in terms of structural reform. The problem in Europe, as elsewhere, is that policymakers are only really going to push through these difficult reforms if their feet are held to the fire. So as long as the ECB is buying them time and space, I'm afraid they're not going to be willing to actually go through with these difficult reforms. And I think that's quite possible. The one thing, we've just had the ECB stress tests come out as well. The one thing that we learned from them, I think, is that there is ample credit supply in the Eurozone. The system is awash with liquidity. There are a number of ways that banks can get liquidity from the ECB. The most recent is the TLTROs, which are targeted long-term refinancing operations. It's super cheap liquidity. The first take-up was in September. It was really disappointing. Banks didn't even want really cheap liquidity. The second one will be in December, and it will be interesting to see how many banks participate in that. But I think that the system is awash with liquidity. The problem has always been and continues to be there's a real lack of credit demand. So companies aren't looking to borrow, and I think that will be the case until the business environment improves, business confidence improves. Companies aren't just hoarding cash as they try to figure out what's going to happen. And that will be exacerbated, I think, over the next year, given the election cycle in Europe. So I think political instability will be a big risk for Europe. So the first thing we need to see, a different approach to the crisis. We're not going to see that. The second thing we need to see is the ECB step in. We are going to see that, but will it really help? On the margins, I think it will, but it won't be a game changer. The third thing I think we need to see in the Eurozone is a massive debt conference, whereby all the countries in the region get together and they decide, look, we just need to write down the net present value of this debt. That's not at all on the table. That's not at all priced into the markets. I think it's probably about 10 years out that we'll see that, so it's not going to happen for a long time. But despite huge retrenchment by peripheral countries in the Eurozone, we've just seen public debt to GDP ratios go up and up and up since the onset of the crisis. Even in Ireland, which grew by around 8% in the second quarter of this year, so it was growing like gangbusters, I think they're going to have a really difficult time stabilizing, let alone bringing down their public debt burden. It's around 130% of GDP, which is extremely high. There are three ways to deal with high public debt. One is to grow your way out from under it. I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of growth in Europe over the next decade. The other way is to inflate your way out of it. I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of inflation over the next decade. The third way is to write some of it down. And I think that's what we're going to have to see so that countries can clear the decks and start anew. It will deal with the debt stock problem. It won't in and of itself deal with the stock flow problem, but I think it will unlock some of the transmission mechanisms for monetary policy, and we'll get credit flowing in the system again. So I think we'll end up having to see a debt conference in about 10 years, and it will be hugely disruptive in the markets. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. And we continue with Michalis Nikiforos, research scholar at Levy Institute.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. The subject of my talk today will be the relation of the so-called twin deficits of the Greek economy, the relation between the causal relation between the public and the external deficit of the Greek economy. To jump right on the thesis of my presentation, I will put forward the hypothesis that in the period after 1995, because of the monetary unification process and later because of the adoption of the common currency, the causality between the foreign deficits and the public deficits in Greece runs from the former to the latter. So it's the growing foreign deficit that it's causing the growing public deficits in the Greek economy. So I promise these are the only two equations in my presentation. These are just accounting identities, and what these identities basically say is that the current account deficit has to be matched by deficits either from the private sector, the domestic private sector, or the government. This is just an accounting identity. Now there are different theories how the causality between these three variables in the second equation, the current account deficit, the net borrowing of the private sector, and the net borrowing of the government sector runs. The most prominent, the most common hypothesis that it's usually put forward by neoclassical economists is that is the so-called twin deficits theory. So in this twin deficits theory, it's the fiscal deficit that it's causing the external deficit. And there, in the literature, somebody can find two main transmission mechanisms. So based on the loanable funds theory, a high fiscal deficit increases the demand for loanable funds. This increases the interest rate and causes capital inflows. This appreciates the exchange rate and lowers the current account balance. And there is also a more direct mechanism that the fiscal deficit increases demand. This increases prices, and this decreases the current account balance. From a neoclassical point of view, there is a criticism of this twin deficits hypothesis through the Ricardian equivalence principle. So if you have rational, forward-looking households, these households are going to know that they will have to pay the taxes for the increasing fiscal deficits at the present, so they will increase their saving. So a higher government deficit will be matched by a different behavior from the domestic private sector, but it's not really going to influence the current account balance. Now, a different possibility, which I would like to argue that it's the case in Greece in the last in the period after the Maastricht Treaty is that the external deficit is causing the public deficit. So for reasons exogenous to the fiscal stance of the government, the foreign position of the country deteriorates, and in this case the fiscal deficit adjusts to stabilize the economy. And this can happen either through automatic stabilizers or through active policy decisions. And obviously a necessary condition for that is that there is a sufficient inflow of foreign capital and the ability of the government to borrow at a relatively low interest rate. And I will argue that this is the case with Greece in the post-Maastricht Treaty period. So this is the so-called, at the Levy Institute we call them the three balances, the resource gaps by institutional sector. So the blue line here is the government balance. So a negative government balance means a government deficit. The red line is the private sector balance. So when the red line is above zero, that means that the private sector saves, has positive net saving, saves more than it spends. And the green line is the external financing. So when the green line is above zero, this means that the country is running a current account deficit. So as we can see here, in the 80s, because of the economy slowdown, the higher interest rate of that period, and also the establishment of the welfare state in Greece, at this period, you have an increase of the government deficit. But it's very important to know that during this period, so in the 80s and until the mid-90s, the government deficit is mirrored by an increase of domestic saving. So the government increases its deficit, but it's borrowing the money from the domestic private sector. There seems to be a break around 1995. So around 1995, until 1995, around 75% of the government borrowing is covered by domestic financing. Around 1995, there seems to be a break, and there seems to be, as you can see, there is kind of a monotonic increase in the current account deficit that continues until the recent crisis. And this deficit is mirrored at the very beginning with an increase in the borrowing of the private sector, but then this huge increase in the external financing is also mirrored by the government deficit as well. Now, so it's this graph that led us to the hypothesis that in the period after 1995, the causality between the two deficits is running from the foreign deficit towards the public deficit. Because based on the previous graph, after 1995, the foreign deficit seems to have kind of an autonomous behavior. Now, let's see what happened in this period. So, on February 7 of 1992, in the city of Maastricht in the Netherlands, we have the signing of the famous Maastricht Treaty. And the main criteria, as we know, of this treaty is the achievement of a high degree of price stability. And the economic rationale, so from a macroeconomic theory point of view, the economic rationale is provided by very, very hardcore rational expectations, neoclassical models, the Kidlaner-Prescott and the Barre and Gordon model. By the way, there was a discussion about the Maastricht Treaty this morning. One oxymoron of the Maastricht Treaty is that it's a treaty for a union of economies, but it's based on closed economy macroeconomic models. So the rest of the criteria and the institution of the European Monetary Union are built around this target of low inflation. So if you take a textbook version of, let's say, the Barre and Gordon model, and you see the policy prescriptions of this model, it's exactly the institutions that were built because of the Maastricht Treaty in Europe. So after the Maastricht Treaty, the monetary, the fiscal, but also the exchange rate policy focus on low inflation. And that's that's the main focus of inflation after 1992 in Europe. And seen from that perspective, Greece really made a very serious effort to comply with the Maastricht Treaty rules. So this is the inflation rate of Greece. You see that with the first oil crisis, you have a huge spike in inflation in the 70s. This very high inflation remains above 15%, and sometimes higher than 20% until the early 90s. And you see how after the early 90s, you have a very, very serious decrease in inflation that goes around 3% in the 2000s. Okay, so Greece really made a serious effort to deal with inflation, and indeed it achieved a very low inflation rate in the 2000s. I mean, by any standards, a 3% inflation rate is not that high. Maybe from the Maastricht Treaty point of view is a little higher than the target inflation rate, or compared to other countries in the north where you didn't have any inflation rate. But Greece made a serious effort to deal with the inflation rate. So the 90s begin with the sign of the Maastricht Treaty, and then the monetary unification process started. So in March of 1993, you have a removal of controls on long-term capital movements, and in May of 1994, you have a removal of controls of short-term capital movements as well. So with this removal of controls, the inflows of capital from all over the world can come to Greece without any control. What is very important for our story here is that in 1995, the governor of the Bank of Greece announced that the main objective of the Bank of Greece would be a further decrease in the inflation rate. And towards that goal, the Bank of Greece announced the so-called hard drachma policy. So basically, the Bank of Greece fixes the exchange rate of the drachma against the EQ back then in 1995, and later at the beginning of 2000, on the 1st of January of 2001, Greece joins the common currency. So what is the result of this hard drachma policy and of this development in the 90s? This is the real effective exchange rate of the Greek economy. As we can see here from the collapse of the Bretton Woods in the early 70s until the early 90s, you have a pretty much stable, with some fluctuations, but a pretty much stable real effective exchange rate. After the early 90s and until 2010, you have a real appreciation of the Greek currency by almost 40%. Okay, I don't think that Greece was never a very export dynamic economy or a very export-led economy, but a 40% increase in the real effective exchange rate, I don't think that any economy in the world would be able to deal with it. So if we plot together the real effective exchange rate with the current account deficit, we see a very nice correlation here. So when the real effective exchange rate appreciates, we see also that at the same time the current account deficit starts to increase as well. In this graph, I have filtered the two series with a Hadrick-Prescott filter, and we can see the same result without the cyclical fluctuations of the two series. So another reason why I believe that the hypothesis we put forward in our paper and in my presentation is true is that it is a common result in the Greek literature that 1995 is a year that marks a structural break for the Greek economy, usually with a positive connotation. So there is this very interesting volume from a conference that was co-organized by the Bank of Greece and the Brookings Institute in 2001. And Brian, Garganas, and Tavlas in 2001 say that the performance of the Greek economy in the second half of the 90s contrasts starkly with the performance during the period 1975 to 1994. Garganas and Tavlas in the same volume point to a regime switch, so they they do some econometric regime switch testing, and they point to a regime switch in inflation in 1994. And Bosworth and Kolitsas reach a similar conclusion from a growth accounting point of view. Now, if somebody reads this literature, he finds out that the Greek policymakers and the Greek economists of the time were aware of the pressures on the foreign sector of the economy due to the hard drachma policy and due to the policies implemented after the Maastricht Treaty. However, they were optimistic, and they believed in the merits of low inflation, the ability of the market to self-regulate itself, and the use of capital inflows for productive purposes, and so on and so forth. Actually, I think this is the phrase that captures like the way people thought back then, that this rate of growth of the period 1995 to 2001 should be sustainable in future years, that one might hope that the Greek experience would more closely follow that of Ireland. Indeed, the Greek experience followed that of Ireland, but in a way that is probably different than what the authors of this paper would imagine. Now, I'm sorry for this long quote, but to be fair to the Greek economists, it was not only the Greek economists or the Greek policymakers who were unreasonable, and they were too optimistic back then. So this is a quote from a paper by no less than Olivier Blanchard and Francesco Giavazzi in 2002. It's a Brookings Papers. And the paper starts by stating the following question: should we worry about the increase in current account deficits of Greece and Portugal after 1995 or not? This is literally the way that this paper starts. And they answer no. And they make this kind of convergence argument that because there is scarcity of capital in the European South and there is abundance of capital in the European North, then according to the neoclassical theory of distribution, you would expect higher returns to capital in the South and the North. So it's exactly what the model predicts. That's what they say. What was happening back then. So it's exactly, this is what Blanchard and Giavazzi say here, that it's exactly what the model predicts, what is happening in Europe, and these current account deficits are natural, and we shouldn't worry about them. Okay, I don't want to go to the details. We also tested this hypothesis econometrically. We did the Granger causality test, the Toda and Yamamoto version of the Granger causality test. And indeed, we find that in the period after 1995, the causality is running only from the foreign deficit towards the public deficit and not the other way around. And we also ran a vector error correction model, and which also confirms these results. Okay, to conclude, my argument, and I believe I explained clearly why I believe that, is that after 1995, after the mid-90s, after the Maastricht Treaty, because of the policies that were adopted, there has been a huge pressure on the foreign sector of the Greek economy. So mainly the increases in the public deficits in that period was an answer to this increasing pressures on the external sector. So from a policy point of view, the only way to have a sustainable fiscal consolidation is to try to deal with this extremely large foreign deficit. This is the only way that you can have growth and at the same time fiscal consolidation in the Greek economy. And I think Eckhard will propose some ways that we can do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our last speaker of the evening will be Eckhard Hein, Professor of Economics at the Berlin School of Economics and Law and Research Associate at Levy Institute.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks also for the invitation to the Levy Institute for this conference. What I'm going to present is a paper, or based on a paper I did with one of my colleagues at the Berlin School. And the research for this paper was funded by the European Commission in the 7th Framework Program in the project called FISWOOD, Financialization, Economy, Society and Sustainable Development. I don't know whether the European Commission will like what we found or will like our implications, but they've paid for it, so they will pay for it. Anyway, before I start, let me make 2 or 3 remarks. So what we do in this paper, which by the way is on the Levy website, so you can download it and get into the details. What we do in this paper is based on 3 presuppositions. The first is that the current policies to deal with the crisis and the imbalances have dramatically failed. Just a quick comment on Megan. I agree with most of what you said, but I'm not sure when we meet here again in 10 years after a period of deflationary stagnation, whether we will still have the euro. So maybe that is at least a bit doubtful from my perspective. So the second presupposition is that the dissolution of the Eurozone or the breakup of the euro is not an option we should go for. I mean, it doesn't mean that it will not happen, but for me it's not a policy option we should go for, because I think the consequences might be even more dramatic than the situation we are in. And the third presupposition is that I doubt that for the near future we will get a fully developed currency union, a kind of United States of Europe, with a federal budget and a fully developed transfer mechanism within Europe or within the Eurozone. So what we are doing is, based on these 3 presuppositions, to discuss the possibilities, the potentials for, on the one hand, to rebalance the euro area, and on the other hand, to deal with this problem of this dramatic problem of an effective demand failure, which is the main cause of the stagnation we are in. So the presentation will have 4 parts, or 4 main parts. So I will briefly go into a theoretical framework to discuss the issue. Then I will derive the general stance for the required policy alternatives. Then I will get a bit more into the details regarding the different areas of policy making, and then I will link this up with the idea of industrial restructuring and catching up with the periphery. The framework we choose for all that is Thurwold's law, or Thurwold's idea of a balance of payments constraint growth rate. And I apologize for using equations here, but I think it might be, oops, this was too quick. Okay. What this equation is meant to tell you is the rate of growth of your economy at which an initial current account balance is maintained. And as you see, it depends on the one hand on your price competitiveness, so on the rate of inflation of your economy with regard to your trading partners, providing that the Marshall-Lerner condition holds. And on the other hand, it depends on your quality, your competitiveness in terms of quality and the composition of your output or your exports. So it depends on the income elasticity of your demand for exports and the income elasticity of the demand for imports. Now, if you take this gives you a kind of framework in which you have the main variables which you have to take into account in order to deal with these imbalances. If you manage to have equal inflation rates in your currency union, then this boils down to equation 2, in which you only have to take care of your income elasticities for exports and imports. If you take this as a starting point, you can see the current account imbalances from 2 perspectives. The first perspective is that your actual growth differentials in the euro area deviate or differ from those which are implied by your balance of payments constraint growth rate. So the growth rates implied by the balance of payments constraint growth rate are not, you deviate from these. The second one is that you take your growth trends as given, and you argue, well, your balance of payments constraint growth rate is the wrong one, and you would have to deal with that. So you either suffer from too high inflation differentials, or you suffer from inappropriate elasticities for income elasticities of the demand for exports and imports. And I will use these categories in what is to come. Now, what is the general stance required for policy alternatives if we take this as a starting point? First, the target of policy making has to be to achieve high non-inflationary demand growth in the euro area as a whole, preventing export-led mercantilist and debt-led consumption boom types of development within the euro area, which were the main causes, or causes for the euro crisis, or at least for the severity of the euro crisis, but also with respect to the role of the euro area in the world economy. What we have to prevent is a development which we see right now, the euro area becoming a kind of enlarged Germany with increasing current account surpluses with respect to the rest of the world. In the short run, this means that we need to stimulate aggregate demand and growth in the current account surplus countries relative to the euro area average trend, and that we would have to adjust inflation differentials through the adjustment of nominal unit labor cost growth in particular. For the long run, it means that we would have to improve non-price competitiveness of the previous current account deficit countries and develop stable financing mechanism for the current account deficits, which might remain due to productivity catch-up. I come back to this issue later on. So what does this mean in more concrete terms? First, again, an initial remark on that. So what we are thinking about is a policy package. So you can't pick only one piece of the package. You would have to go for the full package, at least at the very end. A package which needs coordination within the different areas of policy making, so within the area of monetary, fiscal, and wage policy making, but also a coordination between these different areas. And all that would have to be integrated or coordinated with a strategy of industrial and regional development in order to facilitate catching up of the periphery. You could argue, well, we have some institutions for this already. I mean, we have what is called the macroeconomic dialogue, and we have a European semester in order to coordinate policy making. But of course, the content of all that would have to be completely revamped, and I come to this next. Regarding the role of the ECB or regarding the role of monetary policies, I would argue, well, monetary policies or the ECB should completely refrain from fine-tuning our economy with respect to inflation and with respect to employment or growth. I mean, what we are currently seeing is, with all the new unconventional measures, is what traditionally was called pushing on a string. So monetary policies, whatever it tries to do, and maybe even effective to do with regard to the short-term rate of interest and with regard to the long-term rate of interest, will not be able to stimulate our economy. Instead, monetary policies should rather target low real interest rates for distributional reasons. The ECB should be integrated or should focus on financial stability. The obvious tools for that are credit standards, reserve requirements, credit controls, and so on. And most importantly, it should act as a lender of last resort not only for the banking system but also for the euro area member countries, because that was the main flaw, I would say, of the euro crisis in particular. A quite pragmatic suggestion would be that the ECB should just announce that it will intervene into secondary government bond markets as soon as the rate of interest on government bonds exceeds the long-run nominal rate of growth of the respective country. This would mean that the ECB would in effect impose a cap on government bond yields. I mean, that is what I show in equation 5, a country-specific cap. So if a country decides to have higher inflation, well, the ECB would only intervene at a higher level of the rate of interest. De Grauwe, 2011, has proposed something similar, in which, when he argued that the ECB should impose a euro area-wide cap which should be 2 percentage points above the yield of German government bonds. I think our suggestion is a bit more country-specific and a bit more targeted. And this suggestion should be, of course, unconditional and would therefore go far beyond what the ECB has announced in summer 2012. With regard to wage policies, of course, wage policies should contribute to stabilizing income shares and inflation at the euro area target rate. Equation 6 is the typical recommendation for that. Nominal wages should grow at the long-term trend rate of productivity of the respective country plus the inflation target for the euro area as a whole. In order to contribute to rebalancing, we would suggest to deviate from this rule. Stockhammer Honoran have proposed this already in 2012, which means if your nominal unit labor costs are above euro area level, your nominal wages should grow below the rate indicated in equation 6. If your nominal unit labor costs are below, then you could grow at a higher rate. Of course, this would mean, from a more political perspective, that we would have to abandon all these policies aimed at labor market flexibilization and of gaining competitiveness by means of nominal wage restraint. We would need a re-regulation of the labor market, the stabilization of trade unions and employer associations, and I guess we would need the integration or the involvement of the governments. The European Trade Union Confederation, for instance, has made the suggestion of a euro area-wide minimum wage legislation, aiming at 50% of the average wage or 16% of the median wage of the respective country. Okay. But again, if we talk about rebalancing the euro area, and if I take a look at empirical studies on the determinants of current account imbalances, the results is a bit mixed, but how I read these studies is that price competitiveness only has a limited or even minor effect on current account imbalances. And I have listed a whole lot of studies here. I don't want to go into them for reasons of time. But if you follow these results, then the effects of such a wage policy as mentioned on the previous slide will be rather limited in terms of rebalancing the euro area. And from this we conclude, or I would conclude, that the major burden for rebalancing would therefore fall on demand management and therefore fall on fiscal policies, and that's my next point. Fiscal policies would, in this kind of policy package, have to focus on real stabilization, full employment, and a more equal distribution of income, of course. And as a starting point, we can take the accounting identity, which has already been used in the previous presentation, which tells us that the excess of private saving of a private investment is equal to your net exports plus your government deficit. Now, if we go for a balanced current account as a long-run target for each of the member countries, this means that in each of the member countries, the government deficits in the long run should be equal to the excess of private saving of a private investment at high levels of employment. Therefore, this doesn't mean that countries run into ever-increasing debt to GDP ratios. It's well known that with a given deficit to GDP ratio and a given nominal rate of GDP growth, your debt to GDP ratio will stabilize at some definite level. A policy of low interest rates would, in this context, contribute insofar as it would prevent or avoid redistribution in favor of the rentiers, redistribution from taxes, so to speak, to taxes paid from out of mass incomes to rentiers' income. And so far, this coordination of policies between monetary policies targeting low interest rates and fiscal policies following the rule in equation 9 is very important. Okay, maybe I just move on in order to come more to the policy implications. Now, if we follow that, it would of course mean that we would have to abandon the Stability and Growth Pact and the further developments, so the Six-Pack, the Euro Plus Pact, the Fiscal Compact, and the austerity policies based on these pacts. But it would not mean that we would have to abandon coordination. We would have to replace the coordination implied in these rules by another way of coordinating fiscal policies. What I, together with several authors, but also other authors, have suggested is to coordinate expenditure path for non-cyclical government expenditure, because that is what the governments can control, and to coordinate it along the rules given on the previous slide. So coordinate them such that on average in the long run the government deficit will be equal to the excess of private saving over private investment in each country. These expenditure paths could be monitored by the European Commission. You could even impose sanctions if governments don't follow these recommendations. Okay. Now the next question is, should we really go for balanced current accounts in a currency union which is as heterogeneous as the euro area? And that's the next point I want to make. I think, or we think, that this target is maybe too demanding and also unnecessary. Unnecessary in particular because in a currency union like the euro area, we have still the potential of catching up of the south with respect to north, and everything equal, this catching up process has an inbuilt tendency towards building up current account deficits in the south and current account surpluses in the north. And we argue, and again, I don't have time to go into the arithmetic details, we argue that this is not a problem as long as the growth rate of the south is higher than the growth rate of the north. Because if this is so, then you don't run into ever-increasing foreign debt to GDP ratios. Your foreign debt to GDP ratio will again stabilize at a certain level. You could even argue that if you target a certain foreign debt to GDP ratio for all the countries, the current account deficits or surpluses will be country-specific depending on your long-run growth trend within the country. Again, you could apply this rule in a country-specific way. You would not have to go for the one-size-fits-all rules or implications as have been suggested by some German colleagues of mine. Now, if we allow for that and integrate these potential current account deficits, surpluses, also into our coordination of fiscal policy making, the next question is, how can we make sure that the South will catch up in a sustainable way? And in the paper we argue that for sustainable catching up, three prerequisites have to hold. The first one is that we would have to prevent unsustainable credit-driven bubbles and consumption booms, because of course you could argue that prior to the crisis, Spain or Greece or Ireland have been catching up. But obviously this was not sustainable, so we have to make sure that this won't happen again. Second, capital inflows should be focused on productivity-enhancing investment and the development of export capacities in order to improve the balance of payment constraint growth rates of the South. And they should be integrated in a European regional and industrial development strategy. Now, what does this mean? How much time is left? Yeah, okay. What does this mean in detail? Well, first, the efficient regulation and even a selective intervention into capital flows might be required. Again, we have made some progress in these areas with regard to the microprudential regulation, but and also with regard to macroprudential regulation. But in particular for the macro prudential regulation. This is still of a kind of supervision and explain nature. It's still unclear who will intervene as soon as capital flows tend to be or prove to be unsustainable or cause macroeconomic instabilities. So I think this would have to be further developed. Next, an industrial and regional policy strategy would have to be integrated with this kind of macroeconomic policy mix, which I have tried to explain. The focus, of course, should be to develop productive capacities, increase productivity, and improve the export capacities, in particular, of the countries of the periphery. From the literature in these areas, we try to synthesize the results a bit here, is that from this, if you want to do this in a successful way, you should have to accept that strategies should have a strong regional character, so no one size fits all. We should go for a high road competitiveness strategy based on high quality manufacturing production as the driver of growth. But on the other hand, the constraints given by the existing structures would have to be taken into account. Following Thirlwall's arguments, the focus should, of course, be on exports with increasing returns and high income elasticities. There have been some suggestions being made in this respect. I only mention here the approach by the German Trade Union Confederation in 2012, and another approach building on that by a consortium of research institutes, so the OFCE, IMK, and CLM. The question then is, usually from the development literature, we get the result that development needs protection. But of course, this is not feasible within the European Union and within the euro area. But you could substitute a protection by means of using public sector credit and public sector guarantees. For this, national development banks, the EIB, and other institutions should be helpful. And this links then, I think, with the third area which we outline. The third area which is dealing with the financing of a stable, of current account deficits related to successful catching up. Again, capital controls within the EU are not available, although in the morning I get some more differentiated views on that, so maybe you should think about this in more detail. What we think about is to use financial regulations, so liquidity requirements, the financial transaction tax, and so on, in order to influence the maturity of private capital inflows into the catching up countries. And an area which, again, several suggestions already have been made, and I think it's worthwhile following up on these, is to pool large parts of investment spending at EU levels, and then focus them, or the financing of investment spending at EU levels, and then to focus them on the catching up countries. You could finance them by member country contributions, EU taxes, or EU debt. Again, several propositions for this have been made. The German Trade Union Confederation with the European Future Fund, then the Varoufakis Holland Galbraith idea of a European investment program, and also Jörg Bibos a paper published also in the Levy series, the idea of a Euro Treasury, which should pool investment and fund it by Euro Treasury bonds. And of course, you could use that as well for targeting investment, public investment in particular, to the catching up countries. Another interesting idea, which would again merit further research and further thoughts, is to go for a public sovereign wealth fund in the surplus countries, which could mop up the excess of private saving over private investment and recycle these to the catching up current account deficit countries. So these are just some ideas. I must admit that I don't have a perfect solution for all that, but I think that the progressive movement would have to think about a package which integrates the macro aspect, so the policy mix between monetary, fiscal, and wage policies, with the idea of industrial and regional policies in order to facilitate catching up. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So now it's the time for questions from the audience. I could start with a question for Mr. Holland. Mr. Holland, you mentioned the incompetence of former European councils and people in the European Commission. How do you view Jean-Claude Juncker right now, and how can you comment on the, let's say, war that's been waged on Mr. Juncker? And do you believe that, certain individuals can actually influence the course of things within the EU?
Yes. Yes, I do. I think history shows us that fairly clearly. Would Hermann Goering have been able to organize a national seizure of power in Germany? Would Goebbels have been able to do it? No, I think the personality of Hitler was vital. Could Guy Mollet have given Algeria independence? No. De Gaulle did. Could Herbert Hoover have recovered the United States in the 1930s? No. Roosevelt did. Not from a profound theoretical background, though he did quite well in his economics course at Harvard. But in his case, he came from an American aristocracy and realized that no banker he ever talked to had got any idea of how to get out of the Depression. Yes, individuals can count. I think that there's absolutely no doubt. I tried to give an intimation on Juncker, but I'm glad to be asked the question. Because, for example, I think the furor about Luxembourg's being a financial haven, you know, to give headlines to this as if anybody didn't know that Luxembourg was a financial haven is really a bit ridiculous. The challenge for Juncker is whether he can act in the manner that he's declared to tackle tax evasion at a European level. And there, I would like him to do what de Gaulle did. It's pretty well known that de Gaulle went to, after the Parliament and Guy Mollet's socialists voted for de Gaulle to introduce a new constitution, he went to Algeria and got on a balcony overlooking the main basin in Algiers and said, "Français, je vous ai compris." French persons, as we would now say, which implied there would be a French Algeria. "I have understood you." And then he negotiated with Ben Bella and gave Algeria independence. So I think as a politician, one can admit certain political constraints. If you are elected by a particular constituency, you may have no mandate in a democratic terms to actually contradict the vested interests of that constituency. You'd certainly get thrown out of office. But he now has a different mandate, and one which he stressed in his statement to the European Parliament in July. He said, "I regard these 10 priorities," in which he didn't include ending tax evasion at that time, as a political pact. Now, it is, in terms of political experience and skill, he has far more than anybody else in the European Council. And I found him very open to arguments. For example, after, I wasn't there when he addressed the Parliament, but I got 2 or 3 reports saying, Stuart, after he'd made his statement, he went on and on and on about the Delors bonds. Whereas the word bond is unmentionable. Schäuble was blocking it, refusing to discuss it in Finance Council and the European Council. So I've probably said enough on that, but do come back if you want to.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions from the audience?
Yes, perhaps a follow-up question for Mr. Holland and also, I guess, Mr. Hein. I think maybe, Mr. Holland, could you elaborate a little bit more on this connection between the European Investment Fund and the Juncker investment plan and how you see that connecting? So, for instance, do you see the European Investment Fund sort of issuing bonds that would then be raised for the 300 billion? And if so, are these bonds something that PIMCO would invest in, knowing that some of it would be allocated to, say, green technologies in Spain? And if so, what sort of return would PIMCO demand for that? And then thirdly, maybe a more practical question for the table in terms of these bonds. What I'm trying to understand is in a practical way how they work. So, for instance, with any country which issues bond, they raise the money, they pay the interest rates, they use future tax revenues to pay the interest, but also, of course, the coupon. But in this particular case, how will the interest be paid to, say, PIMCO? And then how will the coupon then be paid back? If you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that, that would be great. And thank you very much for your intervention.
Okay, in case I walk past you outside, I can't see who you are, and I don't know who you are. You are who? Where are you? And who?
I'm in the very back, and
great.
I work for the ILO Research Department
Very good.
At the International Labour Organization.
Very good. I'm very glad you asked these questions. When will the coupon be paid back? Are you aware that the Bank of England is rolling over bonds which were issued to finance the Napoleonic Wars? People don't, investors in bonds don't necessarily want the money back, especially if I'm saying this, my voice sounds more aggressive than I would wish, but the question, the issue of paying the coupon back is not really the key issue. But let me answer your other points. Who would service them? You see, your question is correctly enough phrased in terms of conventional thinking of national economies paying. But that's not the case with the EIB, and I'll come to the EIF in a minute. The EIB repays investors in its bonds by gaining income from project finance. France has rehabilitated 365 hospitals, as many as there are days in the year, with EIB co-finance. And the revenues, yes, the revenues certainly come from national taxation, but not to pay the interest on the coupon. It's a real income effect. The European Investment Bank can lend for up to 30 years at a fraction of 1% above base rates. And in terms of the relation between the EIF and the EIB, then I'll come to PIMCO. An anecdote is relevant. I made the argument to Delors that there should be a European Investment Fund. That was actually the original name proposed at the Messina conference for what then became the original investment bank, the European Investment Bank. Why? Because I wanted an instrument that did not count on national debt. For example, US Treasury bonds don't count on the debt of California or Delaware. Then you say, yes, but Europe has, the US has a common fiscal policy, so they're serviced by taxation. Quite correct. But the EIB's bonds are not serviced from taxation. They're serviced from, or by common European taxation. They're serviced by the income that is generated from national tax receipts. My report for Delors was published, as it happens, in November 1993. I did all the econometrics with a team from Alphametrics, which does the statistics for employment, indeed, in Brussels, and formerly was the Cambridge Department of Applied Economics before it correctly predicted the rise in unemployment under Thatcher at 4.5 million, in which case Thatcher abolished 10 of their 12 posts, and the two people in charge, Terry Ward and Francis Cripps, decided not to take those two posts, but to set up Alphametrics. Now, the work that we did was not only recovery promoted by investment. There were three elements which came out at about 15 million jobs then, and registered unemployment at the time, early 90s, was about 18 million. One was investments. Two was social negotiation of reduced working time in return for agreement to flexible production, which we never hear anything of here. You know, we hear structural reforms. Structural reforms are a euphemism for stripping workers of their rights and for making it easier for people to be fired, like the Hartz legislation in Germany, which was followed by Siemens, Volkswagen's, Bosch, demanding 4 hours extra work, 4 to 5 hours extra work for no increase in pay. Whereas flexible production, in the case of Japan, is how Toyota came from producing as many vehicles in 1948 in a year as General Motors was producing in a day to overtaking General Motors in 2006. And it's complete reverse of the insider-outsider model of Lindbeck and Snow. It's, you know, I don't know how many people in the audience know about this, the insider-outsider model, but I expect many of you do. I was at the launch, Dennis Snow's launch of that book in London, and the idea is the outsiders would be prepared to work for less, yes, if trade union rights were reduced, diminished, or abolished. And I said, Dennis, how does your model relate to Japan? So he said, well, why? So I said, well, core workers in Japanese companies are assured employment to the age of 55, which is why why continuous improvement in the sense of Kaizen works, because they can, if they introduce a better method of work organization, they know they won't be unemploying themselves or their co-workers. So Dennis said, I don't know about Japan, it may be different. But this thesis has had profound influence in many German employers. And, but to get back to EIB, AIF, I was rung up by Tom Barrett, a director at the EIB, who said, Stuart, we've seen your report, and we've seen the President's white paper, in other words, the white paper on growth, competitiveness, employment. We see that you make the analogy with the US, that the EIF bond should not count on national debt. Then he added, maybe you don't know, and maybe the President, i.e. Delors, doesn't know, that of the present 12 member states, only 2 of them count borrowing from us against national debt. Well, that was not widely known. Many finance ministers didn't know. I tried to get that case across to Greece, before the Olympics that half the Olympics could have been financed without counting on Greek national debt. Now, these are potentially very big European gains. And and I also put the case to Gordon Brown, because the two countries were the UK and the Netherlands. And I managed to get a letter in the Financial Times on that point sometime later, and an official from the Dutch Finance Ministry emailed me and said, "Dear Professor Holland, we know of no treaty provision which means that we need not count EIB borrowing on national debt." To which I replied, "You're perfectly right, there isn't one. That's just how it is. There would be double liability. If the EIB were responsible and Greece were responsible, there would be double liability." So the Dutch now don't count it in national debt, and I got through to Gordon Brown, and Britain doesn't count borrowing from the EIB on national debt, and as far as I can see, no member state does. Now, some finance ministers don't know. Central bank governors know. I don't know if we've still got even one present, but they know perfectly well. But, you know, you've got a radical government coming in, like Delors comes in as finance minister of France in 1981 with an expansionary investment program. The governor of the central bank of France is not likely to say, "Look, Jacques, did you know you can borrow anything you like from the European Investment Bank and it won't count on national debt?" Of course they don't say that, especially in the conditions under which Maastricht, you know, has been such the parallel pressure to reduce debt and deficits. But the EIB, I'll finish on this, the EIB quadrupled, I think I said this, quadrupled its investments from 1997 to 2007, including expansion of investments in health, education, urban renewal, etc. Then it ran into crisis. I did say this. It ran into crisis because many national governments couldn't keep up their commitments to co-finance projects if, with the stringency being demanded by Germany and others on reducing debt and deficits. So by that time, I frankly thought, though I proposed the European Investment Fund and drafted it, and it can issue bonds in terms of its statutes, that we got through. I frankly thought that this was probably a footnote in economic history. It wasn't going anywhere. But now, in this crisis, the possibility that the EIF, rather than being dependent on pension funds, can recycle global surpluses, as the BRICS have made plain, that they would invest in them, has surfaced in the debate, the current debate that's been going on, because Macron, for example, said we should boost the capital of the EIF, which is only 4 billion, by putting in 40 to 60 billion from the European Stability Mechanism, which isn't being used. Schäuble said no. That appeared blocked. But Macron certainly has got the argument that the EIF and EIB can jointly do this, and it's partly because it's for many reasons. But one of them is when I was no longer persona grata because I'd resigned from Parliament, persona grata in a Brown Blair, I was going to say Brown Blair, New Labour party, Michel Rocard co-opted me onto the Economic Committee of the French Socialist Party. And when I was making the case and the rationale for the Delors bonds, Michel Sapin, who after all is now French finance minister, said, "Stuart, we just had the Edinburgh European Council. This wasn't how it was explained at Edinburgh. John Major was told that if the EIB issued bonds, then Felipe González would have to service them for the high-speed rail link between Madrid and his constituency rather than the British taxpayer." So, of course, this is how many political decisions are taken. It's, again, Helmut Kohl didn't understand what a bond was. He came out of, when Guterres first managed to get the proposal that the EIB should invest in health, education, urban renewal, etc., Cole said no. And as he was coming out of the council meeting, journalists said, "Councillor, I mean, why are you opposed to this?" And he said, "The German taxpayer has paid enough." He didn't know. You see, there's an obsession with fiscal transfers. He didn't realize a bond is not a tax transfer. And then the very brilliant diplomatic advisor to Guterres said, "Well, what are we going to do?" So, well, Guterres said, the three of us were meeting. And so he said, "Well, I was at OECD some time ago with a chap who's now one of Cole's advisors, Herr Bitterlich. Maybe we should write a memo for the Chancellor." So I have some German, but I wouldn't dare draft a memo for for a head of government in German. But I drafted it, and I said, "Dear Chancellor, Amsterdam European Council is coming up, and undoubtedly, yet again, Prime Minister Guterres will propose that the European Investment Bank should invest in health, education, etc., etc. But, as of course you understand, EIB bonds are not paid for by the German taxpayer, and they actually give a very good outlet for pension funds and so forth. Cole, I'm going to finish on this point, unless you want to come back, either now or afterwards. Cole changed his mind, and that misled me. Let me at least admit one thing that I got wrong, rather than right. I thought there was a chance of turning Merkel. But the difference, I've had to deal with Thatcher. I managed to change Thatcher's views on, for example, saving a cancer unit in St. Thomas's Hospital in my constituency in a very late night debate, which was probably her first introduction to the circularity of income and expenditure. There isn't a hospital built that isn't built by private enterprise. There isn't an operating theatre equipped that isn't equipped by private enterprise. There isn't a drug prescribed, hardly, apart from some generics, that isn't by private enterprise. So that public spending sustains the private sector rather than drains it. We managed to change, to get Cole's support. So far, we've got very little from Merkel. Though she hasn't, she's nominally going along with the Juncker recovery program, nominally. Bond finance.
Next question, anyone? Yes, of course, the gentleman with, yes, you.
I'm Lex Hoogduin, speaker this earlier today, University of Groningen, the Netherlands. I've spent a large part of my career in the Dutch Central Bank and a small part of my career at the European Central Bank. That by way of introduction. I must say I'm in a very strange mood myself listening to this panel. The day before yesterday I was invited by the Dutch Parliament for a hearing on how to deal with deflation. And if I look at, let's say, how people looked at Europe, looked at the economy, and I listened to this panel, these are two worlds apart, as it were. And I'd like to make a comment, basically following up on the presentation of Eckhard Hein, which I very much liked in its comprehensiveness and its consistency also. But one of the things that you stressed is that you need a comprehensive approach, a full package. And I wonder whether that isn't a big mistake. And why do I think so? Because we have to take into account, whether we like it or not, that there are different economic models and philosophies around in Europe, and that there are differences between European countries. There are different views about what Europe is and where it should go, and what the nature of the current problems is. Now, of course, everybody may think that he is right, and then you can read articles in the Financial Times, for instance, saying that of the German economists, most of them haven't read Keynes, and those that didn't understand him. And maybe that's the case, but it's a given. And I think in the absence of a political mechanism to decide on the issues, on which way you should go, we do not have a political union, and I think everybody agrees that is not on the cards for the time being. I think the only way forward is to see where we have common ground. And if I listen at least to Eckhard Hein, he says indeed we have to keep the euro. That's by far the best way to go, and don't count on a political union for the time being. I would agree that I think that is a fruitful way to start from. But then on the basis of that, you have to come up with something that is to the taste of all the different, at least the main different views around the table. And I think if I were to go back to the Netherlands and say, well, I have a plan, a way forward, and would put on the table a complete overhaul of the whole European construction with deep treaty changes, it simply would not fly. Not even a small probability. So I think we should all together try to find a way forward where you focus on, let's say, on the main things where you have a chance to convince the other of your view, and be prepared to accept some of the things that they really find important in the overall approach. So I think the two things that are most promising is the point about wage policies, because your formula on what is an acceptable wage increase is accepted very broadly. Also among the conservative central bankers that come from countries where Schuld and debt are the same word. They accept that formula for wage increases. They tend to accept that wage increases in Germany and the Netherlands have been too low from that perspective. And Jens Weidmann is on record for arguing that wage increases in Germany should be higher. So if you in some way or another could make that a part of the package, I think that is promising. You do not need, at least in some countries, to completely overhaul wage policies. It can be done relatively simply. And I think the second area to focus on where you have a chance of making progress is indeed a growth/development strategy for the euro area. But there I think it is important to have an approach which is not based on saying, like I've read somewhere, not here, but somewhere else, what is important that we have as high a number as possible for the investment policies. If you start to do that, you can be sure that you get a lot of opposition from Germany, the Netherlands, because it must be sensible projects. It must be no waste. It must be clearly a policy. I think focus on these two in a sensible way, and I think that you can also get agreement very easily that you don't have to have current account balance in all the countries. I think that's not even in the current regulations that is required. So that would be an additional restriction if you were to introduce that. So that's not necessary. But please don't tinker with the ECB. That's dangerous if you want to achieve something. And if you want to introduce policies that are too dependent on EU treaty changes, you open really Pandora's box, and that's also dangerous for all the parties. And then I think don't abandon completely the idea that structural reforms may be helpful in some cases.
Yeah, thank you very much for this comment. And First, my purpose was, of course, not to say that we either can do what I present or we should do nothing. So this would be a misunderstanding. It was just meant to present a full package, which I think is required if you really want to go for a kind of European growth model which is sustainable and will provide us with equal environmental sustainable and financially sustainable growth. But of course, that is what I think is my role as an academic, my role as an economist. But of course, on the other hand, I would be fully on your side arguing that we won't get all this at once, and we should check what we can get and where we can find alliances or build alliances in order to get that. I observe with pleasure that the ECB, if this is true, now has turned around regarding wage policies, because I can still remember the early 2000s when the ECB and the national central bankers in principle endorse this rule for wage increases, but always argued, well, as long as if you have unemployment, then you have to deviate from this rule. So if this has now been abandoned and they all follow this rule, fine with me, and I'm glad to have them on my side. Maybe I'm too much. I'm too much impressed by my national central banks. That may be true. The second point is, but related to that, and that is, I think, where the policy package becomes important again, is how do we make sure that we get what we call for, what we demand? Because on the other hand, central bankers, and here again I include the ECB, call for structural reforms in the labor market. Structural reforms, or the whole debate on structural reforms, was on decentralizing wage setting, was on making wage setting more or adaptive to firm-specific conditions and so on. And all the literature we know on wage bargaining coordination is that this is detrimental to achieving the wage rule I would like to have. So if you go for that, then please accept the consequences and abandon the demand for increasing or for further deregulation of the labor market. I think you can't get or can't ask for one thing without providing making sure that the institutional foundations for getting it are provided. So that's my first point. My second point, tackling with the ECB. Well, I'm very much on the side of the ECB. In my view, the ECB has been the institution which has made sure that we still have the euro. So the ECB is the institution with this gradual development towards a central bank, a true central bank for the euro area member countries. Without these steps, I think the euro would always have exploded or imploded, as you want to see it. But, of course, what I don't like in the ECB policies is this link of, on the one hand, guaranteeing government debt, on the other hand, making this conditional on austerity policies which undermine the growth which you need in order to grow out of your debt problems. So I think there is simply an inconsistency in the current policy model, and we have to draw attention to this inconsistency, and we have to provide alternatives to this inconsistency. So that is my reply to that. A final point, and maybe I guess we will completely disagree on that. The core of my approach is that we have to regain room of maneuver for fiscal policies. So the idea of a debt break, the idea of a fiscal compact, I think was the worst which could be done in the situation we were in and we are still in. And I think that's something which has to be overcome. I mean, you could try to do this with extra funds which don't count for the deficit, and I'm on your side. I would again support that. But in the very long run, what we need is room of maneuver for fiscal policies in order to make sure that we don't end up into a situation of what now even in the mainstream people like Larry Summers and others call secular stagnation, in which we allow for government deficits whenever the private sector saves more than it invests. So that was basically my starting point for that. And, well, I think that's important to draw attention to that. It's important to focus on that. And, of course, we would have to abandon the Stability and Growth Pact and the following regulations in order to get there. But without that, I think we might muddle through for the time to come, but we won't get what I would like to get, namely a European growth model based on equitable and sustainable growth. And I think it's important to mention this. So to sum up, I think we don't disagree, so I would agree that we should make progress where we can make progress, but we should, on the other hand, also have an eye on the consistency of the policy recommendations we put forward.
Okay, yes. We still have time for a few questions, so please.
Μπορούμε να βάλουμε μετάφραση.
Ναι.
Καλησπέρα. Κύριε Holland, σε εσάς θα ήθελα να απευθυνθώ και να σας ρωτήσω, η ερώτησή μου θα είναι λίγο γενική, αλλά έχει βάση τις αποκαλύψεις για τον κύριο Juncker. Και θα ήθελα να μου πείτε για ποιο λόγο αυτή τη στιγμή, το 2014, από εδώ και πέρα, οι Ευρωπαίοι πολίτες πρέπει να εμπιστευτούν τους Ευρωπαίους ηγέτες. Δηλαδή, ποια είναι τα κίνητρα, δηλαδή να μου πείτε το λόγο που πρέπει οι Ευρωπαίοι πολίτες να πιστέψουν σε αυτή την κοινωνική και οικονομική συμμαχία στην οικογένεια της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Let me repeat that. A very good question, because nobody's really got any confidence in anybody anywhere in the European Union at the moment. For example, I was encouraged by, there was a blog in Euroactive blog when François Hollande was presidential candidate, and it said the presidential candidate is going to follow the advice of the British economist and former Labour MP, the well-named, play on surnames, Stuart Hollande, pour émettre des obligations, to issue European bonds to mutualize debt and recovery. And I read that I had my computer in the kitchen, and for a moment I was very pleased. I thought, well, maybe finally, finally it's going to happen. After all, this guy could be president of France. Well, we know the story now. His popularity rating is down to what, 14%? But I think the case with Juncker is that, for example, he's been finance minister or prime minister, putting on one side the fact that I happen to have been briefing him, he's been finance minister or prime minister when most of these major changes that I've been talking about, the challenges and the responses, happened. For example, the Amsterdam Special Action Program was in the spring of '97. The decision that the terms of reference to the European Investment Bank should be extended to health, education, urban renewal, virtually anything, was at Luxembourg under his presidency. Now, whether to what degree he can use this is perhaps open to question. For example, I'm talking of the European Central Bank, and I agree with you. It's in one level lamentable that even Mario Draghi has still been making references to structural reforms. How many battles can you win on one front in one day? You know, unless, for example, if you want to, we had a meeting, the Economic and Social Committee, and I don't know whether this paper's been made available, but endorsed a paper in 2012 that basically I wrote on restarting growth. Let me say, before we have a question on the environment, growth, of course, is a dirty word for an environmentalist. Sustainable development is even hardly permissible. But if you are actually investing on a major scale in alternative technologies, who was it mentioned, for example, these technologies for Spain, the Troika cancelled the fuel cell, not the fuel cell, the sun technology program of Spain. I don't see that there's a guarantee, but let me put it differently. Somebody I have known very well indeed, Jacques Delors, did not have the political experience that Juncker has when he became president of the Commission. Like me, he'd been advisor to a prime minister and resigned. Then he was very briefly finance minister. It was not a major success. He wasn't entirely to blame. He invited me to come and see him in 1981, and it was in the Louvre, rather than the rather horrid French finance ministry a bit further up the Seine. And we had lunch, and he said, do you know whose room this was? I said, no, of course I don't. He said, allegedly it was Madame de Pompadour's boudoir. Fine, but of course that's not the point. He said, how am I supposed to be finance minister when I am 18th in order in the government? I'm the 18th minister. He said, this expansion cannot be sustained. And in terms of some, it's not my job just to defend Jacques Delors, because I happened to work with him and was rather close to him. But there's some criticisms which are really unjust. For example, that you, and I've seen them in the Financial Times and God knows where else, though I should qualify that, especially since Munchal has moved partially, at least, towards the position that Yanis Varoufakis and I have been arguing on recovery, and also because Martin Wolf tried 3 times 2 weeks ago to get a paper that I'd written on this published in the FT, but they've got better things to do. I'm not here just to sell a book, but you might actually be interested in the book. And there's some rather strong endorsements from, for example, in the foreword to the book, the report to the law that I published in 1983, just this point, because the criticism, some of the criticism I've seen of Delors is he was too technocratic. He had no idea of a social Europe. He was consumed by the idea of a social Europe. He wasn't at all technocratic. And what it says is the interim and final versions of the report to European Commissioners reinforce the case for a European recovery programme which could make it more feasible for governments to achieve the national budget and borrowing conditions for monetary union in Maastricht and offset the they haven't put the term in. Anyway, the original said, to offset the deflationary effects of the Maastricht debt and deficit criteria. He was well aware of that. That's why he gave me carte blanche. And I'm glad to say a very significant budget, not for myself, but to mobilize, about 28, 30 people across Europe. He's very, and I think that, but nonetheless, and although Delors had very considerable political force, the Sun newspaper in Britain at one point did not recognize he was only president of the European Commission. They thought he was president of Europe. Juncker has more experience. I think the tax, it's a pity that he's been distracted by the tax haven of Luxembourg. Everybody knew it. What he stressed is that if you're going to tackle tax evasion, it has to be done at the European level. I don't think he'll succeed with that. It is, however, very interesting that there's the procedure called enhanced cooperation, whereby Germany, Austria, and others, Finland, the Dutch, have moved, I think the Dutch, have moved for a financial transaction tax. If one of the points that I made to Juncker, and it's in our report from the Economic and Social Committee of 2012, is that it is open, I think I said this, it is open to move that, for example, the European Central Bank should buy EIB, EIF bonds on the open market as a general economic policy of the Union. Now, I think Mario Draghi would welcome that. And of course, the other thing, which is, although the Bundesbank has so assiduously claimed to be totally independent, the subclause of the article referring to its independence are that without prejudice to the internal and external stability of the currency, it shall support the general policies of the Bundesrepublik, Bundesregierung, die Bundesregierung zu unterstützen. Without prejudice to the internal and external stability of the currency, it shall support the general economic policies now of the Union. And the general economic policies of the Union can be decided by the European Council. And that would reinforce his hand against sniping from Weidemann via Karlsruhe to the European Court of Justice. And the other point, you really should cut me short on this, and I suspect that I've enjoyed this meeting, but also would like would like a break. But I think there are ways in which, therefore, because I agree with the criticism of quantitative easing, he knows it. I had high-level meetings on this with, for example, Jörg Asmussen when he was the German executive director. And what Asmussen said about the Commission is not repeatable. What he did stress is that governments have to lead on the basis that bonds are fiscal policy. And I made that very plain to Juncker. I think he knows it very well. We shall have to see, but you can be, for one, if on Tuesday it is a fudge, if there's no real money, several of us should join together to say so and to stress that they've got to think globally. The final chapter of this book is on the global implications. I mean, I follow this stuff as closely as about anybody. That doesn't mean I get it right. I'm not saying that, but I do follow it. And Barroso, when he brought out this proposal on stability bonds, there was no reference to the global economy. None at all. It's all completely introverted, inward-looking, which is absolutely typical of DG economy and finance. And the recycling of global surpluses is clearly important to the BRICS. A recovery of the European economy is clearly important for America. I think Juncker knows that better than any commissioner elsewhere in his team, though the drafting of Tuesday's document has been given to a Finn.
Just to address the question about why we should trust any of these people, I guess I would put back the question to you, what is your alternative? And in my view, the biggest risk in the Eurozone in particular now is political and social. Everybody's lost faith in the centrist parties in the Eurozone, and there are a number of alternative parties that are springing up, but quite a few of them have a pretty nefarious underbelly that I'm certainly worried about. I think it's possible we could be looking at France led by Le Pen, for example. Whatever the social policies that I'm personally against, the markets would go nuts, and that would be difficult for Europe as well. So it's one example, but there's one in almost every Eurozone country. So, the question is, what's the alternative? I don't think it's much better.
one more question, yes, from the gentleman up there, yes.
Mr. Chairman, I have two questions, one for Mr. Nikiforos and one for Ms. Greene or the panel. The first question is that what is his opinion about the parity that the Greek drachma joined the euro? Was it an appropriate one, or was it a mistaken one? Just to take into consideration that prices went up 15 times in 13 years. Secondly, Ms. Greene said that the European recession may take 10 years. According to the Japanese experience, after the Plaza Agreement appreciation of the yen in 1985, there has been a recession since 1990. So there is one homogeneous country, Japan, with hard work, high spirits, and so on, that is suffering for 23 years. So in the case of the European area, there are 18 members. And if we take the marketing notion of cannibalization, perhaps you are aware what cannibalizing the product means. So if there is a cannibalization of the European North and European South, or a cannibalization within those two blocks, do you think that 10 years will be enough, or should we multiply 10 by 18? Thank you.
Well, the argument I want to put forward is that when the only goal of the policy is inflation targeting, then the exchange rate tends to be overvalued, and that's the problem with with the exchange rate parity in 1995 and later, also with the parity that was introduced with the euro. So that's the problem when the only goal of policies is inflation targeting.
I think you're right. It's possible we could be facing more than a lost decade in Europe. I think just as I explained that as the ECB and the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, they're all easing, even the PBOC in China today has cut rates. Everybody is trying to devalue their way back to growth, except for the US, which is considering tightening. So it's really a beggar thy neighbor strategy towards growth. I mention it because I think the Eurozone is kind of a mini version of that, whereby Germany is really employing a beggar thy neighbor strategy vis-a-vis the rest of the Eurozone. So how long can that go on? I mean, I mentioned earlier that I think Germany needs to make some adjustment as well. I don't think that can go on for decades, and I think the trigger will be social or political. Either we'll have a big government in Europe collapse, possibly in Italy, because who could possibly be the alternative to Renzi? It's not clear. That could be a potential trigger, or it would be social in terms of political unrest. And unfortunately, forecasting the timing of that is extremely difficult, but I don't think that this can last for more than a decade.
I think our time is up. Yes. Thank you all for coming. A big thank you to our speakers.